It's great to be back in Singapore, what I always find one of the most interesting countries in the world to visit, and I'm honored to have this chance to speak here in this meeting sponsored by RSIS. What I'm going to do is talk for a bit, and then I look forward to the give and take, to questions or comments or reactions. So I will leave at least half our time for that, because I look forward to learning from you all and hearing what you have to say. What I thought I'd do is talk about some of the features of international relations in the 21st century, essentially the evolving, emerging world. Because even though this century is only 10 years old, 10% over, we're beginning to, I think, see some of the outlines of history. And then I wanted to end with some of the questions that I think are now out there. So let me begin first with what I know. Here we are. It's it's October 2010. So just to take 10 seconds to situate us, it's roughly 20 years after the end of the Cold War, roughly 2 decades after the end of the Cold War, roughly 10 years, almost a decade after 9/11, and approximately 2 years since the financial crisis erupted. So what do we know? What can we see? Let me give about 10 or so features of the emerging international system. One is the diffusion of power. Essentially, the wide distribution of power in many forms, economic, military, political, cultural, what have you, but also, perhaps just as important, in the hands of many actors. This is not a period of history where 1 or 2 or 4 or 5 states dominate or control the world. This is a period in which dozens of states have significant power and influence. The fact that the G20 has grown up is not a coincidence. But it's also a time in which many actors other than states have significant impact and influence. They can be benign, say the impact of an organization like the Gates Foundation in the world of health. Its budget on tackling global health problems may be greater than any other single entity in the world. Or particular financial institutions in private hands can control portfolios that dwarf the GDP of many countries in the UN General Assembly. Or these actors can be anything but benign. It could be a group like Al-Qaeda. It could be a gang that is threatening the stability of parts of Mexico. So all I'm trying to say is that what's so interesting to me, indeed it's the most dominant feature of international relations, is the general diffusion of power into many hands. The phrase I would use and coined is non-polarity. We've moved from a world of 1 or 2 or several poles to so many that it no longer makes sense to speak of poles, but rather points. Secondly is, inconsistent with that, is a shift away from what you might call the OECD world. It was not that long ago that the great concentration of wealth was in the hands of the United States, Western Europe, and Japan. And for a lot of international relations in the post-World War II era, it was dominated by these 3 concentrations of wealth. That is not the case anymore, and each day that goes by, it will be less the case. And I wasn't very good in math. One of the many reasons I got my degrees, like many of the students here in international relations, is I probably couldn't pass any courses in math. But I can do this math. I can do this much math, which is if the United States is growing at about 1.5%, and Europe is growing at about the same rate, and Japan is growing even more slowly, and China is growing at 10%, and India is growing at 8%, and Brazil is growing at 6% or so, and so forth, that over time there will be a redistribution of wealth in the world. And when you have a redistribution of wealth, other forms of power inevitably are associated with it. So it's the United States and Europe and Japan still collectively account for at least half of the world's GDP, probably, or actually above that. But gradually over time, that position will change. And what you'll see is greater wealth in the hands of other countries in Asia, and also Latin America and Africa. And that will be the redistribution of wealth. Thirdly, one of the features of this year of international relations is, the first two things I talked about were simply neutral. Here I'd say is positive. A very low chance of what you might call systemic war. And I point this out if only to differentiate the 21st century from the 20th century. 20th century had three systemic wars: World War I, World War II, the Cold War. And these are the conflicts or competitions that essentially dominated history. For the foreseeable future, the century is a long time, but for the next decade or two at least, and possibly longer, depending upon how talented our diplomacy is, I think there's an extraordinarily low chance or low probability of a systemic war between the United States, which in many ways is still the dominant power in international relations, and anyone else. Or to put it another way, if you were the leader of Singapore or the United States or what have you, and you get up in the morning, there's a lot of things to worry about. You've got a pretty crowded inbox. But I would not put at the top of the inbox, or among the things that would keep me up at night, would not be the outbreak of a war, say, between the United States and any other major power, be it China or India or Europe or Japan or Brazil or anybody else. And again, I simply say that to differentiate this moment of history from so much of what's preceded it, where the principal dynamic of international relations was great power conflict. That was the defining dynamic of 20th century international life. One way to think about the challenge of diplomacy is to make sure that remains the case. And one of the things we'll have to ask ourselves, and to get ahead of myself, is whether this is a temporary respite from history, or whether this is something that will endure. And I would simply say there's no way of knowing the answer, and in part it depends upon what happens within certain countries, but also in part it depends upon the quality of our diplomacy. Fourthly, if my numbers are right, if systemic or great power dynamics are not the dominant feature of international relations for this era, what is? I would say it's global challenges. For the time being, the principal challenges to international order are global. It could be the spread of nuclear materials and weapons. It could be terrorism. It could be disease. I mean, we dodged the bullet the last few years in pandemics, but who knows about this winter or the one afterwards. Energy and climate-related issues, challenges to an open world economy, be it trade protectionism or financial breakdowns. Other forms of trafficking. And essentially what all of these have in common is their global nature. It's things that are crossing borders in ways that governments can't control, in some ways governments can't even monitor. And these are the phenomena which are shaping the context in which international relations takes place. And many of these are potentially quite negative. Now again, other features of globalization, don't get me wrong, are extraordinarily positive. Tourism, travel, the free flow of information, the internet. Though the internet's also a perfect example where it could be a wonderful thing for the distribution of information and knowledge. On the other hand, that it could also be the principal recruitment and training tool for global terrorist organizations. So a lot of what goes on in globalization is simply this phenomenon of cross-border flows. Things moving in great volume and great velocity. And again, you can put positive or negative signs on it. All I'm saying is it's one of the cardinal features of our age. What else? Coming back to something I said, if the principal dynamic of history at this moment is not the great powers colliding with each other, it's more the opposite. And when I think about when the history of this period is written, it's more likely to focus on weak states than strong states. That it's weak states, which the Pakistans, or others, where particularly some of the negative aspects of globalization are likely to take root. Afghanistan before 9/11 was obviously very much a Nigeria, which is a weak state, vulnerable to all sorts of civil friction and potentially where states where governments don't enjoy legitimacy and hence, as a result, are quite brittle. These are the places, and what makes these so dangerous, I would suggest, in a global age, is when weak states have problems in policing what goes on within their own territory. When weak states have difficulty meeting international obligations, the effects are not local. But rather, if you think of globalization as a series of conveyor belts or transmission belts, what happens inside the territory of a weak state is unlikely to stay there. So a country that has is not able, for example, to maintain a proper health system, in which various types of viruses or whatever take root because you can't raise animals in a certain clean way or what have you, or where health authorities can't monitor outbreaks of certain types of diseases, then people get on airplanes and suddenly we have epidemics at a global level. And this is, again, a function of weak states, or states that, again, can't make sure that their territory is not used by terrorist organizations. They simply don't have the capacity to control what takes place within their borders, which is a normal facet or feature of sovereignty. These are, because of globalization, these problems tend not to be localized, but very quickly these problems tend to be global. I think I'm losing count, but I think it's up to 6 here. If everything I've said up to now, or at least most of what I said up to now, is right, what strikes me as a student of international relations, which all of you are, or you wouldn't be here, is the gap between these challenges and the arrangements that are in place to meet them. In virtually every area of international life, I am struck by the gap between the rules, arrangements, organizations, institutions on one hand, and the challenges on the other. In virtually no area of international life would you say that the arrangements and rules and capacities are of equal magnitude as the challenges. And I don't care whether you're talking about trade, or look at the recent disputes over how to deal with chronic surplus countries, or countries that are not allowing their currencies to float. So clearly the IMF and our financial mechanisms are not adequate to the task, as we're seeing in the meetings in Seoul, the G20 meetings the other day, or what to do about an Iranian nuclear program that is clearly inconsistent with the Non-Proliferation Treaty and with Iran's obligations to the International Atomic Energy area, or climate change, where you had the complete failure of Copenhagen, and there's no global mechanism to deal with greenhouse gas emissions, with carbon. You know, we can go down the list. But every one of the global phenomena that has a dark side, if you will, I would suggest that the regional and global mechanisms that are in place to deal with them, there's a gap or shortfall that is quite pronounced. Many of these issues, let me come to the next point, are geographically concentrated in the greater Middle East. And if you think of the world as essentially a world, just for argument's sake, of roughly 5 regions, you know, the Western Hemisphere, Africa, Asia, Europe / Russia, and the greater Middle East, just for argument's sake. I know you can define it more in a more refined way, but let's just deal with it in a fairly large sense. It's interesting how high a proportion of the global challenges emanate from the greater Middle East. It's in many ways the principal locus of challenges of terrorism, of proliferation, energy, obviously, resources, and so forth. And all I would say is I see very little evidence that the greater Middle East is succeeding either at dealing with the problems between the states of the region, or that it's dealing successfully with problems within the states of the region. Or to put it yet another way, I see very little of the prerequisites of stability emerging in the greater Middle East. To the contrary, whether it's classic conflict between states, or challenges emanating from within states, the Middle East remains the cauldron, if you will, of where a lot of the challenges to the international system are likely to emanate from. And again, I come back to the point about globalization. What originates in the Middle East is unlikely to remain in the Middle East. It's because of the integration that is so inherent in globalization. The Middle East is affected by things, but perhaps more important, affects what goes on in the rest of the world. And what concerns me is, again, I don't see in place the prerequisites for the emergence of market-oriented open societies, and I don't see that the conditions of ripeness, R-I-P-E-N-E-S-S, ripeness, exist for the settlement of longstanding disputes between and among the states of the region. By contrast would be Europe, my next point, where Europe is quite successful, certainly in the geopolitical sense. Indeed, if you think about it, a lot of 20th century history was about Europe. The first half of the century, a lot of it about the Franco-German relationship. Obviously, Britain, the central party to that as well, but an inability to come to terms with the rules and the balances within Western Europe, leading to 2 world wars. And then in the second half of the century, the Cold War, and the principal, not sole, but the principal arena of which was in Europe. Well, now, to use Ronald Reagan's phrase, Europe is largely whole and free. And it is no longer the fault line of international relations. The Franco-German relationship, for whatever frictions or differences there may be over questions of budget deficits and domestic-led consumption as opposed to export-led economic growth and the rest, these problems look pretty good compared to the problems of the 20th and 19th century. And the degree of integration in Europe as a result of the European Union is unprecedented in the annals of international relations. Even Russia is, I think, less of an outlier than it was. And if you read about all the new connections between, among other things, the EU and Russia, I think there is an attempt to integrate Russia more deeply into Europe. So I would say that one of the features of this era is fundamentally different than the previous era, is that Europe is unlikely to be the arena of international conflict or competition. To the contrary, again, it's whatever limits there may be or problems in Europe as a result of economic growth or anything else, it looks pretty good compared to the 20th century. I'd also say, next point, is that Latin America and Africa look surprisingly well. If you look back at the literature in the field, I don't know how many of you are studying development economics and the rest, or how many of you are regional specialists on either Latin America or Africa. But if you look at the literature 20, 30, 40 years ago, and you look at the realities now, extraordinary progress. Not uniform, not universal, but extraordinary progress. And the debates have changed significantly. And in Latin America, despite some of the attention given to Mr. Chavez and his misguided policies in Venezuela, you look at Brazil, you look at most of the countries, even at Cuba, which is beginning to open up and reform itself economically. The direction of Latin America now, largely, mostly democratic societies, fairly open market-oriented economies, a remarkable transformation from, say, a generation or 2 generations ago, and far, 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 indeed hardly any conflict, far, far less conflict compared to, again, say the wars in the 80s in Central America or what have you. Even Africa, for all of its problems selectively and on all the question marks, again, we're now, out of the dozens and dozens of countries of sub-Saharan Africa, we're beginning to see some real examples of economic growth. It's interesting. One of the measures I have is I live in New York, and I look at what my investor friends, where they're spending their time. And increasingly they're going to Africa. And people are now starting up investment funds and the rest for Africa. That is a remarkable development. It just simply wasn't the case. It reflects a greater degree of political stability. Again, not perfect, not uniform, but a slightly greater degree of stability between and within states, because investments of this sort require a fairly long time horizon. And again, the adoption of policies, greater welcoming of direct foreign investment, slightly reduced role for the state, that is quite exciting. And then last but not least is the dynamism of Asia. This is the part of the world where you're seeing the greatest degree of economic success, with very few exceptions. And again, a number of remarkable transitions into, in some cases, considerably more open societies, and in some cases, somewhat more open societies. I mean, hybrid is the word of the day, and everybody has its own model, its own uniqueness, but all things being equal, if I were to compare the Asia region today to the Asia region 1 or 2 generations ago, again, far more open politically, and certainly even more open economically, increasingly integrated in itself, increasingly integrated in the world, and again, it's largely escaped conflict. And that to me is a remarkable statement, only because history would suggest that any time you have this many centers of decision-making, you have this degree of dynamism, of massive, impressive sustained rates of economic growth, you still have a good many unresolved border issues, you've got agendas from the past that have yet to be dealt with. It's quite extraordinary how Asia has, so far at least, been the arena of this great economic, to a lesser extent, but still measurable extent, political evolution, but it has not overwhelmed the circuits. It's not spilled over into conflict. And that's, again, impressive and noteworthy and exciting. So those are the principal features, and I'm sure I've left some out, and I'd be curious to hear what you think I've ignored or gotten wrong. What then are the questions? So to try to provoke, let me separate the questions into 2 time periods. One is the next couple of years, the near term, and then the medium and long term. For the near term, there's 3 things in particular that keep me up at night, besides jet lag. One is North Korea. There is a succession underway, as everybody in this room knows. What none of us knows is how it will unfold. But it's not obvious to me that North Korea has put into place how would I put it, a sustainable trajectory. I think the pictures that have come out of North Korea, there's an element of them that strain credibility or credulity. And whether you're putting into place a new leadership that will be able to rule and will enjoy support, I won't even use the word legitimacy, but support at home from important elements of that society. And obviously the potential is if things begin to unravel in North Korea, how is that managed regionally, and then obviously with all the global consequences it would have. So I think one of the question marks is simply North Korea. More than any other country, China has the potential to influence outcomes there, but even, and the question is how China uses that influence, and I think there's the question, there's a difference between influence and control. So I think North Korea is I would argue, is one of the potential sources of instability. By the way, regardless of how it evolves, either if it loses, if order breaks down there, that's one set of scenarios that could lead to tremendous adverse consequences, though potentially good consequences if it leads to the reunification of the peninsula under a responsible government such as Seoul's, or that North Korea continues the way it is and continues to do whatever it does with nuclear materials and who knows what else. So there's all sorts of ways in which North Korea could be a source of instability to the region and the world. Secondly, as I mentioned before, is Iran. Iran is on a trajectory either to develop nuclear weapons or to get very close to them, to get many of the advantages of nuclear weapons without necessarily going all the way. I don't know what their ambitions or intentions are. I would simply say that it's not clear the world will or should acquiesce to that. and that the United States, Israel, conceivably others, at some point may decide that what Iran is doing is unacceptable and act upon it. There are obvious risks and costs if the world were to take steps against Iran militarily. I would simply say there are tremendous risks and costs if the world does not and acquiesces to an Iranian nuclear weapons capability. And there may not be good options, at which point you have to decide which are the lesser of the bad options. But not acting is an option. And to live in a world in which a regime like this one, given its support for terrorism, its support for fomenting radicalism around the region and the world, would be allowed to live with nuclear weapons, seems to me is an incredibly dangerous and risky course. And no one in this room should assume that if Iran is allowed to do that, that it would stop there. But rather, one can imagine a greater Middle East where other countries follow suit. And as problematic as the Middle East has been for the last several decades, a Middle East of multiple fingers on multiple nuclear systems is, ought to be anybody's vision of a nightmare. And then lastly, it's what else keeps me up? I worry about everything from crises over currencies, the dollar in particular is a possibility, just given America's chronic deficits. And I worry about other things that could simply, I've got my basket. It could be another terrorist attack on a large scale. It could be the breakdown of order in an important country. I mean, there's the catch-all. None of us has a perfect crystal ball. And there's just lots of things that can go wrong out there. Not to say they will, but if they were, very few of them would not have larger repercussions. What about the longer term? And what would be sort of the real challenges or questions out there? And let me just throw out 5. One is whether we will be able to close this gap that I described before between regional and global challenges and existing arrangements and institutions. And again, this week we've had examples of the difficulty in doing that with the G20. But more broadly, if you look at all these different avenues of, or areas of international developments, the question is, can you get enough of the major powers in the world and the significant powers, and the G20 is a shorthand for that, but though the G20 plus, can you get them to agree on what needs to be done and then to go do it? Two separate issues. One is an intellectual agreement, and one is then actually implementation or execution. And I would simply say, not obvious to me that you can get agreement on what needs to be done, and even when there's agreement, you can't necessarily get everybody to do it, because that might involve resources or difficult domestic political decisions or what have you. Secondly, closer to home here, the big question is China's rise. What will ultimately be the character of 21st century China? Here is China, world's largest population, now the world's second largest economy. How will China use its ever-increasing power? What will be the character or personality of China's foreign policy? How will the Chinese define success, regionally and globally? What is a sense of how will China decide the purposes of its increasing capacities, and how will it then act upon them? A third big question that will affect the character of international relations is one that's close to my heart, is what happens in the United States. And I think the question is, we are running, as you know, large deficits on the order of $1.3, $1.4 trillion a year. Our debt as a percentage of GDP is beginning to get perilously high. And I think the one way of capturing or characterizing the challenge is, will the American political system be able to take the steps that I would argue are necessary in order to reverse these trends, and not resolve them overnight, but put the United States on a sustainable trajectory that essentially would gradually reduce the deficit, I think on the orders of several $100 billion a year, and get the United States in, again, a much more sustainable position in terms of the relationship between its debt and GDP and its need for foreign financing. And I would simply say that's an open question. Fourthly, can we do something to interrupt or stop the recruiting chain of terrorism? There's a lot of talk about counterterrorism, and counterterrorism is obviously a life or death matter, to try to use intelligence and law enforcement and military forces and the rest to stop terrorist acts before they happen. But what worries me about that is that's already dealing with young people, mainly men, when they've already made the career choice to be terrorists. And the problem is sometimes they will succeed. One of the jobs I had in the U.S. government is I was the U.S. envoy to the Northern Ireland peace talks for 3 years. And at that time, well, for some of that time, there were acts of terrorism, as you all know, in Northern Ireland. And as the IRA once told Mrs. Thatcher when she was prime minister after an attempt on her life that came close to succeeding and narrowly failed, they said, well, we didn't succeed tonight, but we only essentially need to succeed once. And so I don't like the numbers or the math of terrorism. But again, we have been, here it is now, it's 9 years after 9/11. And while there have been significant terrorist attacks in Mumbai and other cities around the world, Bali and so forth, so far at least none has been at that horrific scale. But the real challenge is to make sure that doesn't happen again, and that's why, again, we do all the things of counterterrorism. But the real question is, how do you interrupt the recruiting chain? How is it you persuade young men, and again, young women also, but mainly young men, not to become terrorists in the first place? How do you get into that cycle? How is it you affect the quality of education in those societies, or whatever? Or how is it you create situations like we had in Nigeria, where the father of the so-called Christmas bomber reported his own son to authorities and said, there's something that's happened to my son, this is wrong, I'm worried about the path he's about to take. How is it we create cultures in which terrorism is no longer tolerated or accepted, but in any case is delegitimized? How is it that that comes about? And then lastly, I would say, is what do we do about energy? And are we willing to do those things we know we should do about energy, to reduce demand for fossil fuels, both to, I believe, reduce the flows of vast sums of money to, in many cases, governments that I wish did not have vast sums of money at their disposal, but also, given the climate consequences of burning fossil fuels, how does it we do something on that? Which it's partially a science issue, but it's even more a public policy issue. How do we create the domestic and international arrangements for dealing with energy? One could go on, but I would end with the following thought, which is we have these trends in the international system. I've identified some of them. I expect there's others. But there's a good many immediate questions, but even more, I actually think there's a good many what you might call systemic questions or profound questions about dealing with some of the big issues of our time. And so here we are 10 years into the new century, 10%, and the fact that these questions are just questions. It's the reason that we have, this period of history hasn't yet defined itself. And it could turn out very different ways. I mean, imagine, coming back to one of the things I said, one of the big challenges is dealing with China's rise. Well, if China doesn't manage its own rise well, and if the rest of the world doesn't manage its own rise well, we could face a situation, conceivably, where you have something of a quote-unquote new Cold War between the United States and China. I'm not predicting it. I, needless to say, do not want it. But it's not inconceivable. And if it ever were to happen, then this period of history would be known as the inter-Cold War period between a U.S.-Soviet and some version of a U.S.-China. I think that would be a real failure of political management and diplomacy, but it's simply one of the ways in which this era of history could turn out. Conversely, you could have a situation where the United States, China, and many other countries are able to close this global gap between challenges and arrangements and institutions, in which case you'll probably have some historian of the future talking about some sort of a concert or some sort of an international community or something like that. I can imagine situations where the biggest problem is not China. You don't have these positive outcomes, but instead these global issues get to be too much. We fail to tackle climate change. We fail to tackle the energy issues, or we have pandemics, or the open international economy breaks down. And we could have an era of marked disorder. And it's an interesting moment in history where things can unfold in lots of ways. And, you know, the bad news is I can imagine bad ways it can unfold. The good news is I can imagine good ways it can unfold. The interesting news, I think, is that it's very much, there's very little that's inevitable. As I look at this, and I try to look at it from, I can't help it, I look at it from the perspective of the United States, but just more broadly, as someone trained a bit as a historian, I don't think there's a lot that's inevitable. That it's very much in the capacity of politics, or in the realm of politics, what happens domestically in critical countries and what happens internationally in the realm of diplomacy. So the fact that many of you have chosen to study international relations, and I assume will choose careers in international relations, good choice. It's going to be interesting, and you are unlikely to find yourself on the unemployment lines anytime soon, because these issues are very much in play. These are very real issues where, again, history could take lots of different courses with lots of different personalities. So stick with it, and I wish you well. And with that, let me take any questions or comments you may have.